I want to welcome everyone to Brookings. I'm Norm Eisen. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies here at the Brookings Institution. And whether you are here in person with us or are joining us via webcast, thank you for being here for today's discussions of whether new progress is possible in the global effort to use transparency and other open governance tools to fight corruption and promote sustainable development. As someone who spent a quarter of a century on these issues, considering them from every different angle in the public and the private sector, in civil society, and as a scholar, I believe we are at an inflection point as we gather here this morning. Yes, corruption remains stubbornly entrenched around the world, costing as much as $2 trillion globally. But there has also been a surge of effort and innovation to address corruption, crescendoing in recent years. A vast amount of transparency and accountability data, initiatives, and alliances now exist. This makes possible new efforts to better use all that data to fight corruption and promote sustainable development. New and comprehensive assessments of what has and has not worked, and if I may begin our day on a note of hope, new progress, and perhaps even new breakthroughs against this ancient scourge of corruption. Today's opening remarks and the first panel will essay a global view of prospects for progress on transparency, anti-corruption, and sustainable development, starting with the experience of the IMF and its plans to do even more to help. The panel will look broadly at our issues from the perspective of the international financial institutions, national governments, and civil society. We'll take a round of audience questions at the end of the panel after the discussion, so be ready with your questions. Then we'll take a networking break. I'm so excited to see friends and colleagues from all over the world who've come in for this day's events, and I know you want to talk to each other over coffee and Brookings' legendary pastries. That's why you've come in from all over the planet. After that, the second panel will focus on a particular and one of the most challenging sectors, extractives, and ask whether open governance can advance anti-corruption and sustainable development along the natural resource value chain. Truly one of the most daunting sectors for this problem historically. As part of that discussion, I'm very, very excited that we will be introducing two major and complementary new multi-year research projects. One from Brookings with our partners, Results for Development, and the Natural Resources Governance Institute, and the other from the World Bank and the IFC. Both look at open government in the context of other factors, necessary complements that we'll hear from our introductory speaker about, like the rule of law and regulatory and enterprise reform. Because so many experts have joined us from all over the world, after brief opening remarks in our second panel, we will proceed to a town hall format so we can hear the toughest questions, challenge us, push us, do not be polite. We can hear the toughest questions from all of you in our town hall on transparency, anti-corruption, and sustainable development. Before I introduce the opening speaker, I'd like to recognize some of the people responsible for today's event. We are very, very grateful to our event co-hosts, the Partnership for Transparency's Anti-Corruption Forum, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and we're delighted to be joined today by our project partners from R4D and NRGI. And I want to recognize all my colleagues at those institutions and here at Brookings who have worked so very hard to make today a success. I'd also like to recognize the BHP Billiton Foundation and its chair, Karen Wood. The foundation is among the generous supporters of the Brookings Governance Studies program that made this event possible. Jeff Healy, BHP's Chief External Affairs Officer will join our second panel today as a subject matter expert, and I look forward to hearing his personal perspective on the issues. I also want to thank Brookings Governance Studies Project Progress for their support of this event. And now, for our distinguished opening speaker, Madame Christine Lagarde. Christine Lagarde is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Having served her first 5-year term, she was reappointed in July 2016 for a second term. She was previously the French finance minister from June 2007 to July 2011, and has also served as France's Minister of State for Foreign Trade. Madame Lagarde has had an extensive and noteworthy career as an antitrust and labor lawyer, and was the chairperson of Baker & McKenzie from October 1999 until June 2005, when she joined the government. Madame Lagarde has degrees from the Institute of Political Sciences and from the Law School of Paris X, where she also lectured prior to joining Baker & McKenzie in 1981, and she has been a great champion of the issues that we are discussing today within the IMF. I would like to welcome Madame Christine Lagarde to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norm. When I listen to you, I think to myself that you should have been a lawyer. And when I look at your bio, I know that you were a lawyer. I'm delighted to be back at Brookings, and so delighted because last time I was here, I think I had a broken ankle. So the situation has improved on that particular front, if not on all other fronts. Now, thank you very much, Norm, for introducing me, and I would like to endorse your recognition, acknowledgement, and thanks to all the institutions that you have mentioned, and that will spare me the task and duty of having to say thank you to all of them. But I would only recognize as well, in addition to all those, Brookings for hosting this and for having us all back together here. And of course, my colleagues from the IFC and the World Bank, and my very good friend, Ngozi, who is with us, one of the bravest women in the world. So, this is an important event. And why do I say that? Because in order to tackle corruption, we need to acknowledge the problem plainly and measure its impact as accurately as we can. The measurement part is, from the IMF perspective, critically important. So our gathering of policymakers, business leaders, and civil society experts is, in my view, a step in the right direction. And when talking about corruption, I always have in mind this beautiful movie, Casablanca. When Captain Renault closes the casino in Rick's Cafe, and the captain says, I'm shocked. I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on there. Which, of course, does not stop him from pocketing his share of the earnings before he walks away. Are we shocked in this room? No, we are not. We know that corruption is a problem, and we are trying to do something about it. And this is what brings us together today. Now, I want to begin my address by asking 3 questions. First of all, how does the IMF define corruption? Second, what have we got to do with it, with the IMF? And third, what more can we do to actually help our membership fight corruption? So what do we mean by corruption? How do we define it? Not unlike many other international organizations, we define it as the abuse of public office for private gain. And each and every word actually matters. We all know that corruption is a complex problem, often involving multiple actors who operate generally in the shadows. Let's take just one example, and I don't want to borrow from the second panel, but I think that's the most obvious example and the easiest in order to understand the ramifications of it. If we take just a bribe in the extractive industries, which is probably the basic, most obvious standard of corruption. Yes, a local official may very well demand a bribe. Or a government ministry or agency can actually turn a blind eye on what is going on and possibly pocket a bit of that. But what about the company that actually offers the money? Surely that company, private sector, participates in the process. After all, for every bribe accepted, there's a bribe that is offered. So for this reason, as we assist our members in fighting public corruption, and our members, I just remind you, are the 189 countries that are members of the institution. They're not private actors, they are public actors, states only. So although our membership is public actors only, we also are committed to looking at transnational private actors who influence public officials. Private actors may help generate corruption through as obvious and direct means as the bribe that I just mentioned. But that's not it. They can also facilitate corruption through indirect means, such as discrete ways of organizing money laundering or tax evasion. The recent example of the Panama Papers highlights the importance of these facilitators and underscores the pernicious way corruption can quietly spread across borders, inconspicuously, up until such point. So to be effective, our approach must recognize the practical realities of the problem and aim to identify the many different dimensions of corruption. And that brings me to my second question. What has the IMF got to do with corruption, given its mission, which has to do with financial, monetary stability and economic prosperity? This is not the core business of the IMF, to tackle corruption, to identify it and to fight it, nor to interfere in the political affairs or budgetary decision of a particular member. The answer, though, that we have elicited and continue to elicit is that there is a growing number of our members who believe that corruption is a macro-critical issue for many countries. And that, I ask you to just remember that word from our perspective, IMF, macro-criticality is going to actually define and delineates the work that we can do, the areas where we can interfere, and those where we don't and actually can't. So thanks to the work that many of you in this room have done, it has become clear that systemic corruption undermines the ability of states to deliver inclusive growth and lift people out of poverty. It is a corrosive force that eviscerates the vitality of business and stunts a country's economic potential. Norm has mentioned it, the annual cost of corruption is estimated, bribery only, anywhere between $1.5 and $2 trillion, which is what? 2% of global GDP. That's enormous. And these costs, we believe, represent the tips of the iceberg. The long-term impact go much deeper and is probably far more difficult to actually measure and assess. Think, for instance, of a government spending taxpayers' money on a glamorous, totally unnecessary convention center or big sports stadium, construction of which the ulterior motives is actually to generate kickback. A year after construction begins, it turns out that the funds in the social service coffers are somehow no longer available for their original beneficiaries. And over time, the money diverted from health, education, actually perpetuates inequality and limits the possibility of better paying job and better life. And as this type of corruption becomes institutionalized, distrust in the government grows and poisons the ability of a nation to attract foreign direct investment and to generate the motivation of young people to actually serve that nation. So the result is a negative feedback loop from which it is difficult to break free. Millennials, if any, feel this reality very acutely. We conducted a recent survey of global youth, and that survey revealed that young people identify corruption, not jobs, not lack of education, as the most pressing concern in their respective countries. And those questions were asked in multiple languages in order to draw and elicit responses from many, many constituencies. And there is wisdom in this insight, since corruption is a root cause of many of the economic injustices young men and women experience every day. Young people also understand another truth. Corruption is not limited to one kind of economy or one kind of country. It can impact every nation. From embezzlement to nepotism to terrorist financing, corruption's nefarious tentacles can take on different forms depending on the environment where it incubates. And that leads to my final question and the launching point of our conversation. What have we already done and what more can we do going forward? Tackling corruption is not exactly a new subject, and the IMF has been at it somehow for a long period of time. Last month, the IMF Executive Board, which is the governing body, took stock of our progress and committed to confronting the problem even more directly moving forward. The board agreed that our members would benefit from an increase in granular policy advice and a candid, even-handed assessment of the economic impact of corruption. It was not an easy discussion, I can assure you. To achieve this goal, new methodologies are needed to better quantify and analyze the problem, and that is why I'm really pleased that today's event marks the launch of 2 new anti-corruption research initiatives led by Brookings, the IFC, and their partners. I know that the IMF will benefit from your work, and I trust that your experience can be helpful to you as well. Allow me to elaborate on that experience briefly. Our work, like yours, begins with initiatives to improve transparency and increase accountability. As Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's take the example of Gabon, for instance. After consultation with our staff, the government committed to publishing data on all major public investments in next year's budget. By 2020, the budget law will outline the financial risks associated with every public company, including those in the extractive sector. Now, for some of you, it might sound a very small step. For some countries, it's a major step. And this work goes hand in hand with our effort on regulatory reform and strengthening legal institutions. What do I mean by regulatory reforms? I don't necessarily mean either more regulations or deregulations, but instead streamlining in order to reduce the number of gatekeepers in charge of permits, in charge of licenses, in charge of approving contracts. On the legal front, it is often the institution charged with enforcement, the police, the public prosecutors and the judiciary, where the rot of corruption sets in. Let's take the example of Ukraine, where we've been extremely engaged for the last 3 years now. The government invited the IMF to help conduct a comprehensive review of national corruption. The subsequent report has led to a series of reforms, including the setting up of a national anti-corruption bureau. These reforms are only first steps. Investigators need increased authority and budget to pursue suspected criminals, and prosecutors must be empowered to bring charges in an anti-corruption court whose magistrates are independently appointed. The Ukrainian situation underscores one broader challenge. To make a lasting difference, international organizations, civil society, and political leaders must work in concert. And it's not always easy, but it has to happen that way. Because otherwise, everybody moves in their respective silo or channel, and there is no meetings of the respective purposes of these institutions toward an improvement of the situation and eradication of corruption. And we must also be realistic about the progress that we make. Cultures, habits are not things that can be eliminated or changed in a matter of 6 months. It takes decades to actually change the course of culture, to change the course of those habits, good or bad. Since corruption is often hidden and difficult to measure, new policies will take years to become effective. Meanwhile, some governments are reluctant to even engage on the issue because they see corruption as a political and not an economic problem. That's the response that we receive very often. Why do you ask questions in that field? It is not an economic issue. It's a political matter. Well, sometimes it is. And we have to recognize that we don't interfere in political choices. But when particular habits, particular channels of moving money around have a macro-critical impact and are clearly falling under the definition that I have mentioned earlier on, then it becomes an economic issue, and we have to look at it, and we have to take a stand, and we have to include those considerations when we put in place a program or where we conduct the surveillance of an economy as part of our job. I believe the IMF can only be true to its mandate if we speak about corruption with clarity, using the C word as opposed to the elusive reference to good governance, oh yes, and offer the tools at our disposal to all our members within the parameters of our mission. Now, our commitment is that the fund can and will do more in the days ahead. It will take the course that it has to take in accordance with our rules, which is that the board is going to have to review the new proposals that we will put to it, and we will work forward. So let me close by returning to Casablanca. No, I promise that I'm not going to sing a rousing Marseillaise or pretend that I'm Ingrid Bergman. I said at the start that it was an important issue. That remarks was not just lip service for the purpose of this particular speech. A coordinated global effort to stop corruption can make the world a more prosperous place and improve the lives of every citizen. I don't have the illusion that suddenly global GDP is going to rise by 2 percentage points. But we can head in that direction. So to paraphrase not Ingrid, but Humphrey, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful conversation. Thank you very much.
Now we will invite our panelists up onto the stage. Panelists, if you'll join us for the first panel. I'll just call you up from the audience, and then we're going to mic each of the panelists up here, so that will give you a brief moment to breathe and consider your questions. If I can invite Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Dr. Ngozi, my friend. And Hans-Peter Lankes. Hans-Peter, will you come up on the stage, please? And finally, Crick Portman. Where are you, Crick? Come on up and join us. Okay. Have a seat there. Very good. Crick, you'll sit here. I'll go down to the end. Okay. Is that everyone? Good. Okay. So, and I'll say a word about each of my friends up on the panel as we go down the row. But first, I want to thank the managing director for her strong words, for her leadership again, and for that commitment that the IMF can and will do more. Considering the up to $2 trillion in losses through bribery that we talked about, another contemporary film came to mind, Gone with the Wind, when you were outlining that. I want to focus on one word in your remarks, Madame Lagarde, which were so rich, and that is the word even-handed. A big focus of our program here today is the push for new progress in anti-corruption, transparency, and sustainable development. But I think it's very important that as we push forward, we consider the risks, and one of the risks is that we're not fair, that we're not even-handed. And I hope you won't, in the tradition of asking tough questions, I hope you'll forgive me if I repeat one that perhaps is on the minds of some of you. How can the fund ensure an even-handed approach on corruption between small and large nations, given the magnitude of their relative impacts? In China, for example, some say the IMF has been too quiet and have compared that, not always favorably, to your recent work with, you spoke about Gabon, for example, or other smaller African countries where the IMF has been very engaged of late. Has the IMF been even-handed? And most importantly, how are you and the IMF going to address even-handedness going forward?
I was trying to find the exact definition of even-handedness, and I couldn't find it in my notes, so I'll spare you the notes. Because even-handedness is a critical concept in all the work that we do at the IMF, and that's why it is precisely defined. But it's, sort of everything being equal, and depending on economic circumstances, then we at the IMF, we have to apply the same treatment and the same principles. But you have these two caveats of everything being equal and depending on economic circumstances that clearly, indicate that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and you don't apply the same criteria, the same principles, depending on the size of an economy, depending on its position in the cycle of development, depending on the institution and capacity development that it has at home. So we have to be mindful of respecting the general principle while applying judgment as to, what are the economic circumstances, what is the key objective that we have to pursue. If, for instance, a country which has corruption issues, but where it's not prevalent or not, reaching cataclysmic macroeconomic dimensions, and at the same time is about to run into a balance of payment major crisis, or about to enter into a systemic currency crisis, we have to focus on that first and foremost. Now, having said that, I'm not trying to find good excuses for turning a blind eye, but I think China, when you look at what has happened in the last, I would say 3 to 4 years, has made some serious improvement in relation to corruption, and has not only affirmed the principle of fighting corruption, but has taken actual action against quite a lot of people. And the expression goes, from tigers to flies, and we have seen a few tigers and quite a few flies as well suffer from that internal campaign that is conducted domestically with political authority. That's an area where there is progress. Have we had anything to do with it? I doubt it. Is it of macro-critical dimension? I'm not sure that it is, but it is certainly a move in the right direction by the Chinese authorities.
Thank you. Dr. Ngozi, I'll up the managing director's praise and say not only one of the bravest women, but one of the bravest people in your fight against corruption. You're a board member at our partner, Results for Development, the board chair of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the former Minister of Finance of Nigeria, and the former managing director a former managing director of the World Bank. I asked the MD about even-handedness. Another big issue is voice. I know as the board struggled the board struggled with these issues. And before I ask Hans Petter about shifting back to the role of the IFIs, let me ask you, because you've seen it from every different angle, inside a national government, at an IFI, in civil society, from the perspective of an anti-corruption champion who has worked at the most senior levels in all those places, what are the most important things that the IMF, but also the World Bank and the IFC need to do better in engaging with governments in this area? And to put a sharper point on it, on voice, do they need to be more vocal, or is behind the scenes engagement the key, or both?
Well, thank you very much, Norman. Thanks to all of you for the support and recognition. Like you said, I've seen it from all sides. And my experience, hopefully something will come out written on that, has shown that no external body can really fight corruption from outside. You need to be able to identify people or actors inside who are willing to work with you. So that's the first thing that we need to bear in mind. The external has a role, but there has to be an internal matching. There has to be a will within that country to fight. So within that context, what can the IFIs do? I believe that one of the most important reasons why people are able to push away corruption is the actual lack of quantification of the issue. I have to say that, you know, a lot of stuff on corruption is anecdotes and whispers and, you know, things you can't really put your guess estimates, things you can't put your hands on. And so people can always deny, or governments can deny, that this is not the case. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about the difficulty of quantifying corruption. It is true. It's difficult, as Christine said, but she also made a remark that measurement is one of the most important things. And this is where the IFIs have a very important capacity. So they should not shy away from doing that, because once you've been able to measure and quantify and put numbers in, and data in the hands of a population, even if they don't do anything about it, if nothing happens with government, the information is there, and they can't get away from it. So that's the first thing, and I think the IFIs are not doing enough in that regard. There's a lot of analytical and theoretical work on corruption, but the actual numbers and studies are not there. Second, very quickly, thing that the IFIs can do is tools. Now we have many tools. We have the whole open government movement and the open government partnership. And within it, I'm on the board of another very wonderful organization called the Development Gateway. And the Development Gateway within this system has looked at open contracting data systems and developed a tool for tracking and monitoring corruption in procurement. You know that governments spend $9.5 trillion on procurement of goods and services, 15% of global GDP. And 57% of the cases investigated under the OECD convention are on procurement. So this is a very important area where IFIs can push governments to use existing tools, such as that developed by people like Development Gateway. And then lastly is the issue of tracking, finding, and supporting those who are fighting corruption. Too often, the organizations shy away. They believe too much in hearsay. They don't identify the reformers and who to support. You have to do that. So 3 things.
We did not prearrange this at all. However, those are the exact 3 themes of the Brookings, the new Brookings study that we're going to be announcing on the second panel. We're going to be talking about the need for rigorous measurement, about evaluating what tools work and don't work, and about how we can support, as part of tracking the tools and evaluating the measures in the field, how we can support the champions. And we're so pleased that we're doing this as a complementary project, working together with the World Bank and the IFC. And so Hans Petter, the Vice President for Economics and the Private Sector Development at the IFC, is on the panel. And I'd like to turn to you now and ask you, Hans Petter. We've heard what the IMF is engaged in. I gave a plug for the Brookings project as well. The World Bank Group, both the World Bank and the IFC, have worked on both the public and the private side to tackle corruption, improve standards and governance for some time. How can the World Bank Group bring together the public and private sector to enhance transparency, promote accountability, and reinforce sustainable development? How can the IFIs complement each other and be reinforcing? And can you tell us a word about the new program that you're announcing today as well?
Thank you, Norm. Thanks for the plug. Thanks for having me. This is a really fantastic opportunity to tackle this issue heads on. And you've already given me sort of a segue into some of what I'm going to say, and you too, Ngozi. The IMF report and what we've heard from the managing director were quite eloquent on the impact of corruption. There's no need to repeat it. Corruption is corrosive. It's corrosive for the perceptions of fairness, of equity in society, the legitimacy of the state and its institutions. It's corrosive for development, and that's why it's relevant for the World Bank Group. We've been at this for some time. President Jim Wolfenson gave a speech about 20 years ago on the cancer of corruption, which helped to put the issue on the map. President Kim has made clear that combating corruption is one of the World Bank Group's top priorities. So what for the IMF is macro-critical, for the World Bank is development critical. What have we done and what more can we do? How should the IFIs complement each other in this? I'll take three perspectives, not trying to be comprehensive. I got 3 minutes. One perspective is the project and client level. The second is creating public goods. This is in particular around measurement and tools. And the third is on connecting policy and the private sector. So on the first perspective, the project and client perspective, that's core for us, of course. We must deter corruption emerging in our own projects. And the main tool for that is integrity, due diligence, and related frameworks. The IFC reviews the integrity and litigation background of its clients. We establish who the beneficial owners of our investment partners are. And we will not invest if we do not know who the controlling shareholders are. Our financing documents include strong representations and covenants on integrity and corruption. And the World Bank Group pursues allegations of fraud and corruption through the Integrity Vice Presidency, which may lead ultimately to public debarment by the World Bank Group and cross-debarment by other development banks. And the business case for all of this is very simple. It's that investing with bad partners is bad business. As investors, we have learned that dishonest people are not good business partners. The second perspective on public goods and the contribution, the powerful contribution that IFIs can make around data and tools. And that's the example here is natural resources, where transparency is crucial, but we need to get better at using available information. We have to make information accessible, standardized, comparable, and that is where this project that we're engaging in, that Brookings is working in parallel, is focusing on. That's the Disclosure to Development project to advance a global agenda on making data disclosure more effective in coming in using this information. And finally, connecting policy and accountability of government with the work on governments at the private level. This is where IFIs have complementary skills and a lot of scope for doing more systematically. This can be local, for instance, in Peru, Colombia, Bolivia. We work together on municipal royalty management with support from donors and mining clients, or in large-scale reforms, such as the one that the managing director referred to in Ukraine, important in the energy sectors, for instance, in Afghanistan, where we do complementary work on upstream sector reform for transparent non-discretionary administration, and IFC works downstream with integrity due diligence, identifying key areas for institutional strengthening. So from the IFC perspective, this mobilizing the private sector, public-private action to create or improve markets, and IFIs complementing each other upstream and downstream is at the core of future development finance.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. And you'll be hearing more about both the Brookings new initiative and the parallel and complementary World Bank IFC initiative in the second panel. But it is important when we talk about progress that we don't only reinvent the wheel, but we look at what we've learned, we look at the data sets that we have already and making best use of them. So I'm very excited to discuss all those issues as we move forward. So Crick Portman of the Partnership for Transparency, TI of Cost, the Construction and Infrastructure Transparency Initiative Organization. Crick, I want to ask you to give us a civil society perspective on all of this. We know that for open governance to make a difference, transparency, accountability, participation, it's not just enough to put the data out in the world and hope it somehow magically improves things. And Hans-Peter talked about utilizing data eloquently. A strong civil society that is capable of using that data to hold people accountable is a necessary complement. As important, I would contend, as global institutions like the IFIs, as the national governments, as leaders in the national governments. You must have the space for civil society and the strength for civil society to utilize things like the data that comes out. What are the things that the IFIs need to do better in working with civil society on transparency, accountability, and participation in order to fight corruption?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel, obviously. And I hope the fact that you call on civil society last is not indicative of the general importance that is being given to civil society in this debate. I think there is a wide recognition now that civil society is a full partner and should be a full partner in any program that deals with improving governance and setting up anti-corruption programs. And as such, I think there are concerns on the part of civil society more broadly about the way anti-corruption programs are being formulated, particularly by institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and other IFIs who carry a very considerable amount of power and force in international development and country-specific development, and has obviously started to realize and given increasing attention to the issue of fighting corruption. But we feel that the relationship and the role that civil society plays in this whole process can be significantly enhanced. Some of us already talked about the measurement, the stock taking, the importance of having correct data before to move forward. And my feeling, and I think this is being shared by a number of my colleagues in the various organizations that you mentioned, is that civil society has not been playing, I think, the role that it can play. This is not an easy issue. Civil society and the context of anti-corruption in many countries is a very sensitive political issue. But nevertheless, I think the knowledge that civil society has, the intimate knowledge of the workings of an economy, of a society, is critical as an input into this. And I think there's a certain degree of skepticism about the intentions that are being mentioned about them bringing in the civil society into the dialogue. And we see very little of that actually translate into action. For instance, I don't want to put the medical director on the spot, but was civil society consulted in the policy paper that came out? To what extent? Will civil society be asked to provide comments on the final version of this document? These are very important issues, and I think having their input recognized and taken in would make for a stronger product, but also I think would satisfy civil society that their particular concerns and their particular knowledge has been utilized. So my voice is really for all IFIs, including the IMF, to reach out to civil society in a more systematic and a sustained fashion, both at the country level and at the global level. The country level I already mentioned, but I think even at the global level, we'd like the IMF and the IFIs to become an even stronger force supporting the fight against corruption. I think what the managing director said is absolutely welcome. I think we've come a long way in the last 20 years. But reading the report and the policy paper, I think in terms of concrete action, concrete proof that the issue has been taken on board much more seriously in the past, there are some countries where it is and some countries, but there are still many where I think the issues are still squarely on the table and not being sufficiently addressed. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and others obviously have a very strong voice globally. And there is this particular issue that was touched upon, which is the space for civil society to be able to operate. This is a very serious issue. I'm also a member of Transparency International. I lost count, but I think that the number of countries in this world that over the last 10 years have resorted to much more restrictive space for civil society is still increasing. Even countries like Ukraine and Gabon that were mentioned by the managing director, I think are not prototypes of places where civil society can go out and speak and say what they want to say. Again, a very difficult political issue, but there needs to be, and I think there can be, more support from institutions like the IMF and the IFIs more generally to make this known and bring this out to the fore.
Very good. I saw the managing director scribbling furiously. I should get you to autograph that page and leave it here for the Brookings Hall of Fame. It's like the first draft of the Constitution, put it in the National Archives. I'll give the managing director an opportunity to respond. Dr. Ngozi wanted to say something. I'm curious to hear from Hans Petter. You've gotten a lot of advice for the IFIs, so we'll hear from you too. We'll let Crick close out by commenting. To make up for my neglect of civil society, since I myself am a part of that, having founded a civil society group, we'll give Crick the last word, and then we'll go to our audience questions. And I would only ask my distinguished panelists to be concise so that the audience has an opportunity to ask you questions. And we will take one question from the ether of social media, #transparency, and you can tweet that at us here at Brookings Governance Studies. Okay, so Madame Lagarde, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you should not take offense of the fact that civil society is last. Usually you keep the best for the last, so you're bound to be in that position. Two things maybe. One is more and more, and we're really working hard on that, and the entire institution led in particular by the communication department and the external relationship affairs is really taking the lead on reaching out. We have, at least at the time of the annual meeting, 2 full days dedicated to the civil society representatives. And we really open all topics for debates, and we'll be very happy to discuss with civil society representatives the proposals that we have going forward. You see, the paper that we just recently presented to the board was a stock-taking exercise of what have we done, where we are. Do you think membership, they are the owners at the end of the day of the IMF. Do you think that we should go further? And clearly the push by the management was, yes, please, let's go further and improve on the tools that we use and improve on the systematicity of the work that we do. That's point number one. Point number two, on the 2 countries that you've mentioned, and without passing judgment on how respected civil society and NGOs are in those countries. We have tried, and I hope with some success, in particular in the case of Ukraine, to really consult with civil society when we put in place the Anti-Corruption Bureau, when putting in place a court in order to, pass ultimately judgment on the matters that were brought to it. We have consulted yet again on where the prosecutor should sit, stand, and be independent. So I think there has been on that case, which is emblematic, I believe, of the role that we want to play in helping with anti-corruption measures. I think there has been a steady effort to not have their support, because that's not the point, but to have their views, to have their comments, to understand how the independence of the court in particular can be guaranteed, because it's really important. The Anti-Corruption Bureau is one thing. What comes next is even more important. In the case of Gabon, we have also, I think it was actually the local chapter of Transparency International that we worked with to see how we can make progress in understanding what's in the budget and what state-owned societies actually do with the proceeds of the sale of oil and things like that. So I think those are good examples of where we see macro-criticality, and that was obvious in those two situations. We tried to reach out to the local actors. We tried to consult with them, to hear their views, to take them on board for most of them. I think in the case of Ukraine, it was particularly clear, including on suggestions for people. And we will continue doing that. Can we do it in a systematic way in each and every of the 189 member states? No, we can't. Because we would clearly be held back, because it's not part of the mandate. But whenever we see macro-criticality, whenever we believe that there's going to be a break on growth, on stability, then we will interfere, yes.
All right, and I'm going to, for the sake of, because we have a hard stop at 10, so that some of our panelists can make it to various destinations around the city and the country, including UNGA. I'm going to ask limit each of you, with great apologies, to 1 minute for a quick reflection or what you wanted to say, and then we'll take our questions. #transparency.
Okay. Half a minute. Great idea on the study, about time. That's what I want to say. Make sure you really understand the pathways to corruption if you're going to look at what is important or works in fighting it. Second half minute. It's on civil society. Now you've got us under the gun. Okay.
No laughing aloud. You're eating our time.
On civil society, very, very critical. I really want to support what Crick says. I found in my own experience, civil society was very important. We had some organizations like Budget that would take budget information and publish it and analyze it. However, be very careful. Civil society also, organizations also mirror the societies in which they grow up in. Not all civil society, in fact, the corrupt people have become so clever that they develop their own civil society organizations, which they use to propagate these things. And I find that people coming from abroad are not discerning enough of which is the good, who could you really work with and who not to. So be careful.
I would summarize that as civil society, yes, uncivil society, no. Hans-Peter.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely no disagreement with this, with this view that civil society has to be part of it, has to be consulted. We have a variety of processes, mechanisms to ensure that, and you know them well, Crick, from your time. And one of the reasons is that ultimately we want accountability, right? So how do we make a difference on corruption? It's by improving accountability, and civil society is one of the main tools that we have to do that. So yes, we want to empower civil society. We want civil society to engage, and we need to be sure that we have those touch points that make that possible. The study that we're going to learn more about later is very much about that, and we keep repeating ourselves, but that's the point. It's about measurement, and then about how to use measurement in an effective way, and that is where we want to help. in fact, help civil society ensure accountability.
Crick, I think you should quit while you're ahead, but I'll give you the last word.
Well, I'd rather not take up time of other questions that might come, but I'm speaking to people here who believe in the role of civil society, but that's usually so important to get us one step further. Far be it from me saying anything about Ngozi, who knows exactly what she's talking about, but the issue here again is, absolutely agree with you, Ngozi, you need the local people who understand the local circumstances to understand who is actually fighting corruption, who is not fighting corruption. And again here, domestic civil society is an important partner to take on board, just to get an understanding of what's going on in the country. And that could apply, I think, to all 189 countries. Madame Lagarde, I don't know, but at least to know what you're talking about, have an understanding, a stock taking that you're talking about. Anyway, I leave it to that because I hope there's some time for questions.
Can I just, don't get me wrong, we listen to all civil societies in all countries, but what I'm trying to say is that we cannot in all our Article 4 have a section on corruption. That's what I meant, but we listen to all civil societies in all countries. And I have mentioned cases where we have built with them. I should mention cases where we have stopped because of them. You know, when, for instance, in Mozambique or in a couple of other African countries where matters are still ongoing, it is because civil society was engaged and was able to say, well, there's the purchase of this thing that is not recorded in any fiscal documents, and we don't see anything in the budget. Could you please look into it? That was tremendously helpful, and that has led us on occasions to just stop a program and say, unless this comes out, we're not passing judgment on whether or not you should buy these things, but we're passing judgment on whether or not it should be made transparent so that people know what's going on.
I think it's a hallmark of the hope for new progress that we're not only talking about anti-corruption and transparency, but the complementary and enabling factors. And we could have just as easily used our time to talk about regulatory reform, to talk about rule of law, courts, police, investigators, prosecutors, or any of the other necessary complements without which the progress we seek is not available. But in order to achieve that progress, we want to take some questions from all of you. I'll start with our colleague Frank Vogel, who's here at the end of the third row. And one of our nice Brookings people with a microphone will come to you with your question, and we'll take the next question over here.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Frank Vogel with the Partnership for Transparency Fund. In the excellent review that the fund has just published after 20 years, there's one thing missing. There's no mention of victims of corruption. There was no mention of victims of corruption on the panel this morning. But when you look at your report, if you don't mention victims, and you don't mention the human rights abuses, and you don't mention the violence that are always the partners of corruption in highly corrupt countries, then do you really believe your interventions at the fund can be sustainable over time? Thank you.
I think that question was for you.
You know, it's obviously part and parcel and the terrible and often dramatic consequence of it. And there are people on this panel who have suffered it. But I don't think that mentioning that is going to necessarily be the conduit to sorting it out, identifying it, making people accountable and responsible for those acts, concealment, misrepresentation, you just name it. So I think that the role that we play, we just have to continue at it. And we have to be mindful of where we cannot go, because then we will be completely useless. So we have to push the envelope as much as we can within the parameters of our mandate, within what our membership tolerates from us. I say push the envelope, but we can't go beyond that, because otherwise we are nowhere and we are of no use.
Okay, I'll take a question on this side over here. This gentleman in the front with his hand raised.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Eisen. My name is Matthew Murray, and I've worked on anti-corruption in the private sector, the civil society, and the government, most recently as a member of the Obama administration. A question for the esteemed representatives of the World Bank and the IMF. How in this new world where we have more data and evidence and metrics, are you seeking to define and measure a very key subjective variable in the fight against corruption, which is political will? Have you put definition or thought into how you define and measure political will in a given partner country to fight corruption, when you see it go up, when you see it go down, and what you can do to in effect, bank that political will? And another related question about terminology, which is, do either of your institutions consider using the word in the most egregious cases of kleptocracy, which is increasingly out there as a term of art in defining how a government which has strong criminal elements in it and has institutionalized corruption within its government structures by putting criminals in charge, in effect, of public goods. Do you use that? Are you willing to use that term in bank and IMF deliberations?
Okay, Hans Petter, maybe we'll ask you to tackle that first.
Yes, thanks. I mean, these are really they're very interesting perspectives. How do you measure political will? I'm not aware of a sort of serious systematic effort to try to put numbers around political will. We see the consequences of political will in the different measures on corruption that we have. Can we move from there to have some kind of political will index? Probably difficult. We're trying at the IFC right now to develop, actually it's a World Bank group effort, to develop what we call private sector diagnostics in country. And one of the dimensions we look at is the political probability for reforms to happen within a reasonable time frame. In that context, we will try to come to such judgments. We do that because this is where we feel we can make the biggest difference. Focus on those areas where we feel that there may be enough political alignment to make progress, and identify those. Can this be quantified? We're currently working with interviews with broad range of people to try to get to grips with that concept. But it's an interesting way. Kleptocracy, we are all, it's a good term. We're all aware of governments where this would fit, or of countries where this would fit. Does this enter our official dictionary? It'd be interesting to put that on the table.
Ngozi, should we use the word kleptocracy more often?
Absolutely, where it suits. You know, in some countries you can have a kleptocratic elite, you know, that just has a stranglehold on the resources of the country. And if that is the case, we should use the word if it fits. You know, but we should do our homework to make sure that, you know, it's really the case, that we have a segment that has a stranglehold on the country. So, yeah, absolutely, we should do that.
Okay, last question. Lady on the aisle.
Can I just add one thing?
While the microphone is making its way.
Just very briefly. Data and indicators, those are really critically important issues. Because in the work that we do, for instance, if we rely on third parties' indicators that are not either sort of UN approved, World Bank would be just perfect as a reference. But if we start moving into other indicators whose accuracy, bias, non-bias is eventually questionable by some, then we have a problem. And I think that the cooperation between the bank, IFC, and other international institutions is paramount for us to be able to move forward, because we don't have the ability, the skills, or the data mission to actually produce those indicators properly. We need to rely on institutions like the bank, and we hope that that can be the case.
Sorry, Norm, on political will, very quickly, I was talking to a former head of state a few days ago who showed plenty of political will to allow information and the fight against corruption in their country. And what happened was exposing this corruption also led to the country being designated as very corrupt. And this person now had on the transparency index the country downgraded. And everybody blamed this head of state and said they were more corrupt than the previous one. I just want to tell you some of the perverse effects of political will. So we have to count for that.
The perverse effects of corruption. I'm sorry we've run out of time. We're not going to be able to take the last question, but I am going to let Crick comment on this question. I'm going to say today's genesis comes from just such a confrontation when the gentleman who now works at the Organization Results for Development, where you are on the board, Nathaniel, came to see me when I was working for Obama in the White House, so proud of our anti-corruption and transparency initiatives. And he came to see me, said, we're downgrading the Obama administration. I said, why? What more could I possibly do? And he explained the evidentiary basis of the organization where he was then working, how it was, and it was a matter of evidence. Yeah. It was not qualitative, it was quantitative. So that's the genesis of today, and that is very much a motivation for both of these projects you're going to hear more about in the second panel. The motivation is to bring some of this, to build on the great work that's already been done, look at the gaps, and build some of this new rigor, additional rigor, inspired by some of the champions who've come before to these problems, to help you when you make your argument to your boards, to your stakeholders, to your colleagues. Crick, the last word.
Thank you for that. There is impatience. I mean, we've been at this game now for quite a long time. And I must confess that I was very pleasantly surprised that the policy paper came out, the IMF policy paper, and I must compliment you on the fact that it was quite frank. And in a way that it was disconcerting. We have been talking about this for 20 more years, and if we're now all of a sudden sitting in a room here together and say we need better data, then let's do that, but let's put some action behind this. I mean, every day that goes by, this becomes an even bigger problem. So the best thing that can come out of this meeting is to say, look, let's not do another set of studies. Well, we should do the other set of studies because obviously the data is important, but let's put some urgency behind this. And let's put this out into the international, the global environment, that this is an issue that we're now focusing our full attention on. And that is lacking.
And you're going to hear about the new urgent action in panel number 2. I expect to see everybody back sharply at 10:15, right? 10:15, help yourself to refreshments. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.